Drawing on Kant and using Thoreau's Walden as an example, this video is dedicated to a central dualism in thinking about system change and a central antinomy in all of philosophy. An antinomy is two contradictory concepts that are completely logical on their own, but directly oppose one another. The dualism I'm discussing is that between necessity, that is physical necessity, and freedom, or breaking with the necessary into something spontaneous and beyond necessity. The breakage rearranges the existing order in such a way that a new order emerges. This is the same as the distinction between nature and freedom, insofar as nature is defined as the material world governed by laws and causative mechanisms. Nature here would extend to both internal and external contingencies, biology, genetics, and the biochemical and neurological causes of material brain activity, social conditioning and upbringing in a physical world, environmental stimuli, physical and chemical laws, and dominant culture as a determining factor insofar as it is heteronymous. By heteronymous, that is, determined by something other than the self, we mean the opposite of autonomous, or simply self-determined. Here we do away with the commonplace distinction between nature and culture and consolidate them in the domain of nature. Freedom is much harder to define because in Kant we can't really hold that anything truly transcends nature and physical causality. An enormous advocate for science and an avid aficionado of Isaac Newton and the powers of human reason would not venture to claim that there is certainly something that evades mechanistic explanation or could be conceptualized through natural law. Kant, Hegel, Marx, and even Lacan mean this when they say that nature or reality itself is rational. There is something ordered within our narrative and conceptual understandings of its laws, which operates at the level of perception. But morality and responsibility require the idea of freedom. Claims of necessity allow for the abdication of responsibility and make ethics, moral judgment, and even systemic change into higher, better, and more just societies impossible. We can say, oh, I had to do that. It's in my nature. Boys will be boys, for a contemporary example. I have to get an expensive car so they'll respect me. You see that all the time. And in the daily grind, strictly business decisions become justified as necessary. Pornography, fast food, sensuous consumerism, cultural views on success, whenever they become heteronymous, the will ceases to be free. The ethics of needing to satisfy natural impulses and urges is not an ethics at all. Having freedom of the will in a natural world, therefore, resolves itself in Kant as a regulative idea, which is absolutely necessary to have. The idea is maintained by everyone. We regard ourselves as the indescribable perceiver who resides over and above the flow of urges and cultural pathologies, the train of thoughts in a psychologically determined mind. It is the autonomous observer who is not even controlled by the dark and twisted parts of the self, let alone by others or customs and cultural norms and social pressures. This is a negative view of freedom. Freedom from the constraints of anything except the autonomous transcendental I. This I may well be an illusion. that provides us with continuity in our various mental states as they evolve. But it is an apperception we must maintain, and it is the thing within us that is only determined by itself and nothing else. The positive view of freedom, therefore, is the view that freedom is the thing which determines itself with its own laws. It makes laws for itself to follow, and any deviation from those internal laws becomes the unfreedom of urges and inclinations, which leads us to stray off the purely free path. Freedom, then, is internally forced upon the self and is necessarily bound by one's own personal law. If you are reduced to being a mere bundle of reactions to nature and culture, you are certainly not free. But the internal law is a spontaneous self-creation. It is a hard and sharp commitment to follow one's own path. Thoreau wrote, "We are all educated thus to be sons of Tell, who was the crossbow-wielding assassin of tyrants who control us. Every path but your own is the path of fate. Keep on your own track, then." Freedom is disciplined, sharp and deliberate, sustained and durable. It is the radical ability to say, like Thoreau, in contradistinction to the whole ethos of a young America, that taxes should not be paid to a society who buys and sells human beings to perform slave labor. The freedom to break with the status quo of a culture of budding consumerism and debt bondage by fiercely holding that simplicity, wilderness and walks aside a pond, literature and artistic achievement, and the fostering of genius are worth more. American transcendentalism of Thoreau and the great novels and stories of Melville and poetry of Whitman at the time were an attempt to carve out a new space in American culture. All of these works of genius were undeniably free. They were an attempt to usher in newly arrived at internal laws and value priorities. An emerging economic and military power that could compete with the British Empire and continental Europe, these individuals saw a capacity for something greater than sheer might and industrial progress in America, and wanted to nurture this deep freedom, whether through the democratic spirit, abolitionism, and resistance to ignoble cultural values that generally lead to desperation. The idea of freedom is indispensable as a first principle in any resistance to a dominant system of doing things. In other words, the world economy and the culture that sustains it. Thoreau was obviously a deeply conservative stick in the mud, resistant to fads and infatuated by the eternal and infinite of wisdom and nature. The capacity to isolate oneself in a cabin in the woods can be used as a metaphor for what must be done to maintain freedom today. We need to construct our mental cabins, shutter the doors, allowing the nomadic visitors of the other cabins to converse, but shutting out the cultural deluge of media, marketing, internet stimulation, press and propaganda, gossip and influence from lapping over our heads and burying our freedom in heteronomy. Kantian freedom in the individual context has its corresponding analog in the social context. If freedom is inwardly coerced internal law, the idea of a civil constitution maintains an externally coercive structure with a mutual commitment to as many freedoms as possible, and constrains those freedoms which violate the rights that allow for freedom to spring forward in the first place. The coercion of public law in its ideal is to prevent any one individual or group from killing or controlling any other individual or group. In an unperverted state, this should allow for a maximization of shared goals by inhibiting those who want to trample others' goals in achieving their own. Kant calls this utopian idea the kingdom of ends, where everyone engages in helping each other achieve their goals. This is not unlike Peter Sloterdijk's more contemporary view that to accompany globalization, we need a sort of global immune system, with all humans participating, working for the benefit of universal humanity, an international immunity to the diseases of the world, climate change, pathogens, biological lack, violence, a truly universal attempt to do battle against the malicious malignancies of our natural existence as a species. Literally, a fight against cancer through prioritizing global research and international cooperation in augmenting our energy system and consumption habits to battle climate catastrophe, a rehabilitation of health infrastructure, an all-out prioritization in providing the impoverished who lack necessities which underlie freedom's expression, and maybe most importantly, a systemic rooting out of the malignancies in our own nature, our self-inflicted wounds caused by our irresponsible, ignorant, wicked, and heteronymous activities, an annihilating of structural exclusions from true universalism, the plight of the poor, women, Native Americans, and African Americans among the most visible in the U.S., wherever individuals and groups have been treated as anything other than a part of a truly universal humanity. All lives don't matter unless Black lives matter. Doing away with the enormous machine of exported military violence and deprivation through sanctions which impairs the freedom of so many to fully manifest. As a regulative idea, not a mere utopian dream, this quasi-Kantian conception of freedom sustains hope and activity, forward thrust, and skeptical caution. Humanity can break from natural determination in the realm of ideas and overcome itself. Our contemporary American conception of freedom in the negative as a freedom from government interference or freedom from law is sorely lacking because it also encroaches upon our individual capacity to coerce ourselves to higher moral heights and deeper moral convictions. The arguments of the American right, which paints the domestic state as a monstrous devourer of freedom, and its military appendage as the harbinger of freedom abroad, is itself a propagandistic, manipulative narrative, a heteronymous ideology. While it is absolutely essential to recognize the heteronomy of state interference, denying the function of mutual adherence to law as a prerequisite to the true flourishing of freedom erodes universal freedom's possibility itself. The question must always be brought up again and again. Is this appendage of governance that speaks as a universal executor of law truly acting for universal humanity and not just a privileged class or racial category? Is the state co-opted by powerful business actors and lobbyists, and can it be wrestled away and made into a universal set of organs to service human achievement? This is the fundamental skepticism that must be maintained. But whether or not we need a mediator for universal humanity in strong international organizations, or at the very least cooperative global relations between different national governments, is hardly a question. In an era of global crises and global economics, global law and global organization is essential. Large-scale coordination of organizations like the WHO and a strengthened UN as an ideal to strive for means international business, international inequality, and international crises like climate change and the global pandemic can be met with global governance. Insist on authentic global human rights as a prerequisite for the freedom that arises over and above them as the priority, as the organizing principle, as the reason for our labors, not as a little scrap from the table of frivolous interests or a lip service justification for the present. One of the valuable things about thinking about Kant and Thoreau right now is that it exercises a rational capacity that leaves behind the well-established axioms, ready-made arguments, and focus group manufactured aesthetics of the contemporary political climate. Democrat and Republican are cultural identities. Their cultish echo chamber slogans and branding have an extraordinarily heteronymous flavor. Abolish the immense webs of structures that build into brains and orient thinking. Tear down the simplistic narratives and the inability to really chomp into a theory that resembles reality. Instead, building up a theory that can be used to deploy an authentic freedom should be our daily goal. We cannot rise above the causal intertwining system of nature and culture and its seeming necessity into the realm of freedom if we cannot, from our most autonomous vantage point, look back upon a narrative that captures contemporary necessity itself. What is that necessity? We must get this job. We must go to this school. We must consume this. We can't solve that problem. We can't pay for this remedy. We must preserve that luxury, that stratification. We cannot prioritize essential services. The imperative language of cultural necessity becomes natural necessity to an unfree mind. We cannot live any other way. But the freest act ever performed is the inversion of this. The alternative to our present system being seen as necessary. Freedom is precisely that moment of transition from one determined way of life to another. The self-determined moral mandate that says this is so utterly and completely wrong, that there are so many better ways. And at the point that inward freedom leaps into the new with the same impulse of a natural cause, something that cannot be any other way, the rightness of the new is clear as the unadulterated waters of Walden Pond glistening in the sunlight. Something never before imagined and conceived becomes absolutely necessary. The old order remains as clay to be molded anew, and molded it shall be. Thank you.